Good morning. Give you a heads up. I'm going to finish up today, maybe, or if not next week. But 2 weeks from today, I'm going to start a new series, a new class on Return to Joy. It's going to be a study of the letter to the Philippians, but it's going to be about finding joy and keeping it. The most angry I've ever had a person mad at me was an elder's wife in the auditorium. She came up to me between the pews and proceeded to blast me because I had said the letter to the Philippians is not so much about joy, but the absence of it. And she went berserk. In fact, I think that was the beginning of my end, among other things at that congregation. It's a delightful letter. It's a great letter. But it's amazing what two sisters getting mad at each other can do to a church. And that's what we'll be looking at Philippians 2 weeks from today, the Lord willing. And maybe sooner. It depends on how far we get today. Let's turn to Mark. Now again, the emphasis that I'm trying to make is I'm wanting to look at the kinds of actions. What did Jesus do? What did he do to interact with people? What were the actions he took to enhance relationships with people and have them pay attention to him? So this is a text in Mark. It just hit me. I'll be glad when all these masks are gone so that I can recognize people. Okay, Mark chapter 6 is a fascinating story. It's familiar to us, beginning in verse 39 of chapter 6. The apostles have gathered around. The people have gathered around. There's a huge crowd that has gathered. And so Jesus sets out to feed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But I want you to notice in verse 39 is an amazing insight into what's going on here. And Jesus is sensitive to what people are doing. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass, which is a phenomenal thing to think about green grass in Israel, because it's desert, most of it. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. Verse 45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd, and after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Now here's the kicker. What is going on here? They're sitting down in groups of 50s and 100s. Does that signify anything to anybody? This was the formation of armies. This is how an army sat down to have a meal in their individual groups of a century, hundreds, or 50s. And I don't know the name for a 50. I know the name for 100, for that's a centurion who's head of that bunch. What's happening here is that the people have come to be fed by Jesus. Well, they didn't know if they're going to be fed by Jesus, but he feeds them all. And in that process, they have sat down like an army. Do you remember what the Jewish expectation was for a Messiah in the first century? What was he going to do? He was going to conquer. He kicked the Romans out. This crowd has sat down like an army. waiting for Jesus as the Messiah to take on Rome. But notice Jesus' response to that. He doesn't, what are y'all doing? Are you crazy? I'm not going to run an army. I'm not up here to be an army. You just need to sit down in whatever your group you want to, but you don't have to be so organized. Would you guys just relax? He does not say that. Instead, he takes care of them. The apostles gather the food, and then he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida. Jesus doesn't want the apostles to get caught up in this military furor. I mean, they were already something like that. Who was the guy who grabbed the sword at the betrayal of Jesus? Peter. You could tell Peter was a fisherman because he didn't know how to aim. He cut off the left ear of the priest and caught his ear. Now, if he was a good swordsman, he would have caught his head or his stomach or something. But Peter was a fisherman, and Jesus said, "That's enough. Chill out, guys. You're doing the wrong battle." The important thing for us to notice here is Jesus was sensitive to the circumstances, to the political realities. Sometimes today, in our relationships with each other, and I'm not talking Democratic, Republican politics, but sometimes we need to be sensitive to the political realities of our business, of our congregation, or whatever it may be, because we need to know what's going on. What are the people doing? What are they thinking? What response should I make to them? And what is the best for them? Not to get my own goals met or to reach my own ambitions, but how can I protect this crowd? And the way he did it was he dismissed the apostles, got them out of the way, sent them across the Sea of Galilee over to a town over on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, Bethsaida, which they're not even sure where it is totally. They've not found it archaeologically. But on that northeast corner, he got them away, and then he dismisses the crowd. He takes care of the crowd. He gets them dismissed. He leaves no thought in their minds, at least that as much as he can help it. He does not leave any thoughts in their minds about, I'm about to start an army. You guys ready to go with me? He diffuses all of that. I think sometimes it's possible for us in some situations that we get so caught up in the moment of meeting our own goals and needs that we don't pay attention to what's going on. This came home to me in 1994. It was in the Northridge earthquake, and it was the 4 days after the Northridge earthquake. All the relief groups and churches of Christ descended on us at the Van Nuys Church. There was a group out of Louisiana. There was a group out of Nashville. There was a group out of Manna in northern California. And all of them were there. Well, my mentor, Randy Lowry, who's about to leave being president of Lipscomb, he's retiring. But he was my mentor in conflict resolution and learning how to do that. Randy said, we need to have a meeting of all of the interested parties. And so he got them all together, and we had them all in a small classroom. And then he did something that I would never have thought about, and if I did, I would have been afraid to do it. He said, what do you need from this? To each group leader. What do you and your group want to get out of this? Now, that's an interesting question, isn't it? We're coming here to help you have earthquake relief. What do you mean, what do we want to get out of it? But he asked the right question, and they did some self-examination, and they realized we need people to know about Manna International, or we need people to know about disaster relief out of Nashville. We need to know about this particular work out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They all had a vested interest, albeit a great one and a good one, but they all had a vested interest in coming to help the earthquake relief. It got off to a wonderfully healthy start. because now we know the game we're all playing. We know what we're dealing with moment, and I don't know if I'm conveying it well enough or not, but it was a magical moment in human relationships and confronting and dealing with what's really going on here. And again, once that was established, everybody was cool and we went on about our business. Some of them were frustrated because they were used to tornadoes and floods. Well, earthquakes don't reveal a whole lot of damage. There will be the occasional apartment building that collapsed like we did, or a huge steel concrete parking lot that collapsed at Cal State Northridge, which it did. But what really was going on was, like, we had a widow in our congregation whose house was red tagged because the whole house was moved over on the foundation 6 inches, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it makes it unstable. You don't know what's going to be happening in that house. And we found that all over the valley and all over Southern California where that earthquake hit. Most of the damage was not seen. In fact, they went into Cal State Northridge. It didn't appear to have much damage, and they started looking at all of the steel girders that made the formations of the buildings, and they discovered wells in that steel work that had cracked and broken. It had never happened in history. Usually those welded joints are stronger than the steel itself. But they were broken, and that was the power of that earthquake when it went off. In this case, from Cal State, it went off about a mile from their campus underneath the ground. And instead of being a slide earthquake like is normally happens in California, like the San Andreas Fault, or it will slide like this was a thrust fault, in which instead of sliding and shaking things up, it went under and shoved everything up. And that was something that they had not experienced in terms of building construction. Texas A&M came out and did in-depth studies to figure out why those wells broke. And what's the point of all that? These helping groups which had come, they were looking for houses to be blown apart and floods up to the eaves of the houses and that kind of thing. And they would drive down the street, and it didn't look like there was any damage at all. But there was a lot. And some of them left pretty quickly because it didn't fit their description of what an earthquake ought to be. In fact, we had insurance people come out from Kansas to try to help us. They came to our house, and they said $10,000, which we knew it was more than that, but 6 months later, which everybody in the news had said, get those insurance people back because they're not used to it, came back out, and we had $60,000 worth of damage in terms of structure and glass breakage and carpets with glass in the carpets and all that kind of stuff. What Randy recognized is what Jesus recognized is you need to know the name of the game. And in this case, Jesus recognized their name of the game was to have an army. His name of the game was to save the world. And the apostles didn't get it, so Jesus didn't want them to get caught up in that turmoil. So it takes a sensitive person who's paying attention to what's going on to understand the situation. Does that make sense? Does this sound okay except for a story about earthquakes? But that's the point I'm wanting to make is Jesus paid attention to what was going on amongst the people around him. And I think it's important for us that so often, if we're not paying attention, things happen. And they are coming along and we don't see it. But we need to be sensitive like Jesus was to this situation. Okay. Enough of earthquakes and armies. Chapter 7. Verse 34. Verse 24. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. You know where that is? It's on the coast of the Mediterranean, northeast coast of Israel. It was a foreign city. It was not a Jewish town. So for Jesus to go up there was somewhat unusual. and surprising to these guys. So he goes up to Tyre. He enters a house. Did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not. Let me get the Bible up so I can read it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. I love that. When Jesus showed up, everybody knew he was there. In fact, as soon as she heard about it, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. That's not Jewish. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. Now that sounds kind of insulting, doesn't it? Calling her a dog. Yes, Lord, she replied, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Now, what's that story about in terms of Jesus? Well, I don't think he's calling her a dog as he is illustrating the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. She wasn't a Jew, and he's speaking her language. Non-Jews knew that Jews looked down on them. Now, they might look down on the Jews, but they also knew that the Jews looked down on them. If you were not a Jew in Israel, in Judea, you were a second class, third class, fourth class person. So Jesus is dealing, what I think, with the sociological perspective of Jews and non-Jews, like he did with the Samaritan woman. He expresses that view, but this woman picks it up and says, that's okay, we'll take the crumbs. Now that's a cool lady. She figures out what's going on, and she doesn't care. She wants her daughter taken care of, and that superseded everything else in the situation. And so they have this interaction where then he drives the demon out. I think sometimes what this story illustrates to me, and see if it makes sense to you. Well, let me use this story as an illustration of what I'm talking about. I was at the Yosemite Bible encampment one year before they closed it down. The government closed it down. We were what they had called historically the church bowl. And they had a speaker stand set up on a big rock, and then on this huge amphitheater, they had built stone benches back during Depression days. But the hills surrounded that, and so we'd have a meeting out there of church on Sunday morning. And there were about, 1,000, 2,000 Christians there. And I was helping pass the communion. Now, it's hard to pass communion to a crowd spread out all over a hill. They're not in rows. You don't, well, did this one get served, or did that one get served, or did we miss anybody? You know, that kind of thing going on. When it's serving communion in that environment, it's hard to maintain your mind on the purpose of the communion. But there are a group of bikers, motorcycle folk, in their leathers, who didn't know what was going on, but they had come up and they were sitting on the grass to watch whatever this thing was. One of the men, I don't have a clue who he was, but one of the men went up to them to serve them communion, and they kind of, what's this? He went on and he looked over towards me, and he rolled his eyes about these weirdos who are at church. He was not very accepting of the visitors. I thought that may explain one of our issues. We're not very good sometimes at accepting those who are different from us. In this case, with Jesus, certainly. And in that case, there on the hillside at Yosemite. We need to understand, even in our day, that a lot of non-Christians are good folks who just waiting for us to share the good news with them, or say a good word to them, or be encouraging to them, or give them something that they need, or be present in a time of need. Just because they're not of us doesn't mean they're not of us. And I've been in congregations where that was so true. Only one, really. Well, two. If you are not one of us, you're not one of us. And we didn't go out of our way to help them. One of those churches is now dead. But the point I'm wanting us to see here in Jesus was always available to anybody who needed help, whether they were part of the spiritual in crowd or not. And I think that's an important lesson that we learn, so that we don't prejudge situations, and I don't think Northwest does that. We've got the inner city work going downtown, and we have them out here occasionally, and so I'm thankful that we have this atmosphere of acceptance here. But the point I'm wanting to get out of this, to sum it up, is Jesus was open to helping whomever demonstrated a desire to know, who had the faith to believe in Jesus in that process. Any feedback? Does that make sense? I'll be glad when the elders decide for us to get rid of masks. Mike?
Well, it makes sense, but I don't understand why he said it. I mean, I understand, but it seems cruel.
It does. Not everything Jesus did is understandable to me. Why did you do that?
It's Deuteronomy 29:29.
What's that?
Why, we don't understand some stuff. It says the secret things belong to God.
Oh, okay. I don't have Deuteronomy memorized.
I just have that one scripture.
Well, at least you have that one. Well, I can't remember it right now. There was another time when Jesus did something that was a little strange. Oh, he told the parable of the steward, the manager who cheated, and Jesus commended him. Explain that one to me, somebody. That's not in today's lesson, but that's another one of those situations that I don't totally understand what's going on. But I think, to respond more thoroughly, Mike, to what you said, it's my thinking that Jesus was emphasizing, even to a greater extent to those around him, God's willingness to accept people of every race when they had faith. And I think that's the operating principle here. She believed in Jesus, and he responded to that belief, even if she didn't fit the normal parameters of social relationships between Jews and Gentiles. It reminds me so much of the Samaritan woman, when she was shocked that Jesus was talking to her, because he was a man, one, talking to a woman, which didn't happen, stranger and stranger. Jewish man talking to a Samaritan woman, which was totally unacceptable. And he's having a conversation with her on a one-on-one basis, which he does here with this woman. So Jesus was breaking all the rules all the time in terms of the Jewish acceptance. Yes, Greg?
So who's his audience here? I mean, he's in a home full of Jewish people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me this is a learning opportunity. I mean, he plays devil's advocate, basically, or takes on the role of what a typical Jew would think.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think he, allows her answer to say, oh, okay, well, see, I think it's maybe an opportunity for his audience to, take a page out of it.
Yep. You ask who is his audience? I think it's us. Because when I look at it, he and the lady and her family are the only ones there. It doesn't record that the apostles are there.
Well, it's
that I see.
He entered a house, right?
Yep.
I mean, so, I mean, I'm assuming that.
And he didn't want anybody to know about it.
But I'm assuming that house is full of, or is of Jewish
Yeah.
descent. Right?
Well, I don't know if Jews would have been in the house in her house, because she was not a Jew.
So it's her house.
Oh, it's her house. You're saying it's her house?
Yeah. So I think it was probably a rather small audience. But I'm not being facetious when I said I think it's for us because it's recorded in Mark for us to know about it. And there were other situations that weren't the most well publicized, but the gospel writers include them, and we get to know about what's going on. Like that conversation that Jesus had with the apostles it's recorded in the Gospel of John. There's a guy over there casting out demons, and he ain't one of us. Jesus said, well, if they're casting out demons, they are, so hush. He didn't say that. I feel that in.
What book are we in? I'm sorry.
We're in Mark chapter 7.
Thank you.
So the point is that there are a lot of situations in Jesus' life that they did not know about in the current situation, but they are recorded for us. In fact, John said there's a whole lot of other things Jesus did, but these are written that you may believe. And so these things in John, at least, were specifically written down to lead us to faith. Okay, Mark chapter 10. Verse 13.
Can we go back to that, please?
Yes?
Okay. He entered a house. Doesn't say whose house. But the woman was there, and she was a Gentile, and she kept on asking him. First of all, she had to have known him, right?
Not necessarily. His reputation traveled well.
Yeah, that's what I meant,
No,
known
no.
of him,
Right.
okay? Were the Jews dressed so different from the Gentiles?
Were they what?
Dressed.
Dressed? Not necessarily, not that I know of.
So how do you tell a Jew from a Gentile in that area?
This is Tyre, which is a Gentile town, and she's a Gentile living in that town.
But does,
No, they didn't wear, not as far as I know, they didn't wear name tags. I am Jennifer, a Greek. But he knew it.
he knew, I know he knew. I'm talking about what she knew.
I don't know.
And then he tells her blah, 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 and she talks about the dogs under the table, and he says, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And when she went back to her home, so it wasn't her home he entered.
Yeah, I agree with her on that. He was trying to hide.
Okay, good point.
Okay. Okay.
She wasn't at home. It was somebody's house in Tyre.
Somehow she was there in his path. Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't the whole thing though about her response? I think he said what he said.
Yeah.
To find out how she would respond, to show her faith. Sometimes you say something even to a child to see how they respond. It may not be inappropriate.
Yeah.
You know, it may not be what you really think, but you want to see how they respond.
Yep.
And that's, to me, that's what he's doing. He's not being mean or cruel or anything. This is how a Jewish person would respond to a Gentile. So that's what he did to see how she would respond back.
Yep.
Isn't that what the whole thing's?
Yeah. Mike.
It's not unlike the encounter Jesus had with the man at the pool when he asked him, do you want to get well?
Yeah.
And then the guy didn't even answer that question, but Jesus went ahead and healed him.
Yep.
I think a lot of those, I agree with you, I think those were lessons for us.
Yep. It's gnawing in my mind. How would they know whether you were a Jew or not? Has anybody ever been to New Hampshire? Could they tell you weren't from New Hampshire?
Open your mouth and talk.
New England in general.
Well, I don't think of New Hampshire because I've been up there on 3 mission trips. They didn't understand a third of my vocabulary. And I didn't understand theirs either. Do y'all know what a frap is? The two who've been there. It's kind of a milkshake, but they call it a frap, or duck pin bowling,
I know what duck pin bowling is.
where the bowling pins are about that big around and about this tall, and you use a ball that you can hold in your hand about the size of a softball, and you bowl. Anyway,
What about a bubbler? You know what a bubbler is?
a butler?
Bubbler.
Bubbler. No.
Water fountain.
Water fountain? Yeah, you can figure out where people are from usually. Okay, before I get off on telling other stories, let's get back to the Bible. Chapter 10 of Mark, verse 13. People were bringing little children to Jesus to have him touch them, but the disciples rebuked them. Somebody explain to me why the apostles rebuked Jesus for having the little kids. Why would they do that? They were men. Yeah, that answers the question. They were men.
They had no status.
Children had no status. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them. I've been in congregations where some of the members were irate because of all those crying babies. Wouldn't we love to have another 2 or 3 or 4 or 5? I've heard Anna and Kevin's little one in here. She's vocally expressed herself. And it sounded so good. Because it meant we got young life here. I don't think our culture's so much like that, though I remember the day where the children were the last one to eat. Anybody remember that? Men ate first, then the children, and then the women. Which said a lot about who cooked. But the key concept here is this was in a culture that did not take a great delight in children. I mean, you had them, and they grew up and fantastic, but they didn't have much to do with them. Years ago, I learned this little trick, and it transformed the children that I talked to. Back when I had knees that would bend, I would get down on the same level as they were. I'd get down on my knees in front of the little kid. And I'd talk to the little kid at that level. For years and years, I did a thing called Pew Packers on Sunday night. All the little kids up through the 2nd grade, I think it was, or 3rd grade, they'd come to the front, and we would do Bible activities. I'd show them magic tricks sometime. Well, one I had to teach a Bible lesson to them. We'd sing Bible songs. We'd say the books of the Bible. You know, all the little stuff you do with the little dudes. And I wouldn't stand up normally. I'd be down on their level. It's very important that whoever we're dealing with, children or adults, we're on their level. Not in regard to physical stature, but in regard to their level. And Jesus is teaching us a powerful lesson about humility. Here he is, the Savior of the world, and he's playing with the children. Or the derogatory term I've heard so much, the little rugrats. He's down there with them. I think that could teach us a lot about our relationships with those who are less than we are, whether they're children or not children. Could apply even to those who have Down syndrome, or those who have autism, or those who have multiple issues going on. Can we get on their level as much as we can to interact and communicate with them, like Jesus was doing this with the children? Again, another example of Jesus' sensitivity and willingness to be with them. So often we're scared of people. Yes, Barry. What was the last?
Totally dependent.
Yeah.
They can't do anything on their own. They're dependent on parents for food, for shelter, for everything. And that's the way we need to be in the kingdom of God. We need to be dependent upon God
Yeah.
for everything.
Another addendum to that is in Matthew when Jesus is talking to them and they bring the children to them. And it's fascinating the way the language is that Jesus says, unless let these children come to you, you ought to have a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the sea. When you look carefully at the context of that, he says little children, but he's not so much talking about little children as I perceive it in this text. He's talking about little children, childlike people. People who don't have a fully developed faith yet. People who are still struggling to know. And Jesus included in that group all of those who didn't get it yet. That you have patience with them. You don't look down on people who don't have your same level of knowledge. I've seen Bible classes where somebody will express an idea that's way off the wall, and I see another member of the class roll his eyes. Where did they get that? Well, they got it out of their own mind, dingbat. That's not nice to say that, but it's their idea and you need to honor it, and don't you put it down. We'll deal with it and talk about it till we get through. Okay.
Can you imagine being one of these children that were blessed and had their hands, Jesus' hands on them?
Not much different than any preacher who would give kids recognition. I don't think they knew it was Jesus as the Son of God. See, you're saying something there that I think is very important for us to think about and sort of reflect on, because, well, I was watching a TV show last night and somebody had sent a bottle of water from the Jordan River and they were going to use that to bless their new church. The Jordan River is water. There's nothing special about it except it's an irrigation ditch, except where they have dammed it up so that they got a baptistry there for the tourists. And I'm not being facetious, that's what it is. There's nothing special about Jordanian water. There was a Lutheran preacher on this trip with us, and he asked another preacher if he would baptize him in the Jordan, and this preacher was of the Instrumental Churches of Christ from Wyoming, a very conservative guy. And he said, no, my understanding of baptism is for the remission of sins and for forgiveness. We don't do it just to do it. And he said it more diplomatically than that, I think. But he wouldn't baptize a guy in the Jordan because, so what? The same thing is true with Jesus. If you'd have been around Jesus, you wouldn't have thought much differently unless you had seen him do a miracle. And even if you did, you might not have been a believer anyway. Because when it came time for push comes to shove, they abandoned Jesus in droves. Jesus says to the apostles, are y'all leaving too? And they were smart enough to say, who can we go to? There's nothing left without you. So for most of the people interacting with Jesus, it was not a whole lot different than interacting with you and me. He had some teachings that got people upset, and so yeah, there was a difference. But just interacting with Jesus, he didn't walk around with a halo or a glow or wear necessarily a white robe or anything like that. He was normal. If you want to know what Jesus looked like, go look into a picture of a Bedouin Arab. That's probably more what he looked like than anything we are familiar with. Black hair, swarthy, probably pretty dark from walking all over Israel north to south, out in the sun a lot. I know it's prophetic and I know it's descriptive language, but Isaiah said he was nothing to look at, like a root out of dry ground. Have you seen any pretty roots out of dry ground here in the desert? Not unless you decorate it up and have somebody who can do that. But Jesus was reaching out to the little ones, whether it's spiritual or physical. Chapter 10, verse 51, we have another situation where Jesus heals. This is blind man Bartimaeus. This is down in Jericho. He's yelling, "Son of David, come take care of me," and they rebuke him. They call to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you," Jesus is. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus, which is pretty good when you're blind. Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Duh! I'm blind. Fix it." "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." I think Janice referred to this concept earlier, and same thing happened at the sheep pool in Jerusalem when the blind man had been the crippled man had been incapacitated all those years and couldn't make it into the water when the water was troubled. Jesus is always asking us, what do we want? And that's a very important interrelationship principle. Whether it's in our marriage relationships, whether it's parents and children, whether it's parents and grandparents, what do you want? Sounds a little blunt and crass, but it's a very, very important question. What are you looking for? What do you really want from me? Because we can assume all day long what they want and probably don't have a clue what the real question is. They have some other need that we may not even be aware of or know about. So it's important that we pay attention to what other people are doing. Chapter 14, we're going to finish with Mark at least, and we'll do John next week. 14, beginning in verse 32, I call this Jesus prepares for battle. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He said to them, "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. And he continues this interaction with God in which he's expressing, it's a one-way street as far as we know right here. Jesus is praying to God, Jesus is talking to God, and he's saying, "I don't want to have anything to do with this if it's okay with you." And of course the answer was, what's okay with me is that you suffer and die, because that's why I sent you into the world. He prepared for battle. The night before the Northridge earthquake, I preached a sermon. I had a series on 7 thieves who steal things from us. This one, the thief who steals your peace. And later as I thought about it, I thought, God was preparing us, because between 7 o'clock and 4:31 the next morning was the preparation time before the earthquake hit. And it stole our peace. When that thing exploded under our house and it felt like dynamite was going off, and both Ann and I immediately came out of a deep sleep and knew instantly what it was. Never experienced it before like that, but we knew what it was. Stealing our peace. Well, Jesus is preparing for the cross. He's preparing for rejection. And we need to keep in mind, most of all, it wasn't the blood, it wasn't the crown of thorns, it wasn't the nails in his hands. That wasn't what Jesus was afraid of. Anybody can handle torture. I mean, look at John McCain. But what was upsetting Jesus was, "Why have you forsaken me?" And God left Jesus on the cross alone. In essence, Jesus, in that moment on the cross, however long it was and whatever moment it was, experienced hell. Jesus went where God was not. And that was the price paid for us, that we might not go where God is not. And so when I think about the crucifixion of Jesus, we think in such physical terms, which certainly there's a reality to that. Who would look forward to that? But he was struggling with the battle of his God, his Father, abandoning him in that moment. So he goes to war preparing for battle by praying to God. And it did not matter whether he got the answer to his question or not. He was dependent upon God. And I think it's crucially important for us in our lives to remember that we are trusting in God. Even in the most horrible of moments, hang on, which is what Jesus was doing, I think. And that's why the resurrection is so glorious. He didn't rise from the dead unless his Father did it. So, when you have a battle coming, whether it's illness, surgery, a spiritual battle, a sense of abandonment, life caving in, whatever it is, start preparing now before it arrives. Okay? We got to quit. Boy, we have a crowd this morning in here. Thanks for coming. We'll stop now and prepare for our assembly.